And you know we are going to ask. It's our big story tonight. Sometimes the best of intentions run into the rough walls of reality. In Washington County, a plan to buy a motel to house homeless folks with mental health issues or drug issues. You know, it sounded great, and for some, it has worked out well. But for others, not at all, leaving at least one mom heartbroken. Our Evan Watson has the story.
This studio apartment means the world to Terrence Jackson.
This is a blessing for anybody. To have our own place to cook. You're not in the cold, you're not in the rain.
He lost his contract job in Lake Oswego and quickly ran out of options.
Well, I lost my truck, so I couldn't sleep in that anymore, so the shelter was the next. And from there, it was like getting little jobs here, little jobs there, and it just wasn't enough. It wasn't steady pay.
Jackson now lives at Heartwood Commons, a hotel-turned-housing facility in Aloha that opened in April 2023. It's Washington County's first building of its kind. 54 units with on-site assistance, an option for people who need a more stable place to live.
I'm happy as heck. I'm happy as heck.
Heartwood Commons is working great for Terrence, but many people thought it would serve a different purpose. KGW found that government agencies sold Heartwood Commons as a building that would help people with housing and higher needs like severe mental illness and substance use, but it's not really being used in that way. A year on, it is working for some and not for others, showing that gray area between intent and what's really needed for people with the highest needs. Heartwood Commons is a taxpayer-funded project, a product of big new taxes to fight homelessness. Washington County bought and redeveloped the Aloha Quality Inn for $10 million. Most of that came from the Metro Housing Bond, which voters approved in 2018. The county is also paying about $1.5 million each year for support services and housing subsidies. That money comes from the Supportive Housing Services Tax that voters approved in 2020, a 1% tax on high-earning individuals and businesses. Seeing the plans for Heartwood Commons, Sally Reed couldn't wait. She promoted it to just about anyone she talked to.
This project had it all. And on paper, it looked beautiful. It looked exactly like what people needed. And I prayed 4 years that my son would get in there.
Reed's son, Philip, has experienced cycles of homelessness for years, in and out of hospitals with mental health challenges. So Sally Reed closely watched the county's presentations explaining the Heartwood Commons project.
Behavioral health support and case managers on site to help support high-needs vulnerable populations maintain long-term successful tenancies.
Thrilled that the county was building something that would provide all the support her son needs.
These types of participants, these are generally people who have higher levels of being hospitalized, who have maybe been within the jail and prison systems. So this can be really helpful for that particular group.
Heartwood Commons is described as a permanent supportive housing building. But what does that mean?
I typically say that there are as many definitions of that term as there are people in the room.
Marcia Hilly is the executive director of Sequoia Mental Health Services. Sequoia case managers help the residents at Heartwood Commons.
And it was a new venture. We had not done this before.
So what were the expectations for Heartwood Commons? Metro's explanation of the project says it serves the highest acuity and chronicity individuals in the community. People with serious and persistent mental illness, people with substance use, people who are unlikely to be successful in a traditional housing setting. Then there's Jess Larson with the county's Department of Housing Services.
The idea is that we want to make sure that through permanent supportive housing, no one ever returns to homelessness.
Larson says Heartwood Commons was always designed for independent living, with support services on site, but optional.
And so if they're not choosing to engage in the behavioral health services on site or the case management supports on site, that's totally their choice. But they might not be getting the care they need inside their apartment, and there's no effective way to intervene.
Sally Reed was surprised when she read the lease that her son signed. It felt standard, not like a lease tailored to people like her son. It required 24 hours notice for anyone to enter and check on Philip in his room, and a threatening action could lead to eviction. Based on her son's mental health needs, she knew that could be a problem.
It was a battle of behavioral health versus housing. And behavioral health lost, which means the people who really needed this are no longer here.
Philip was evicted from Heartwood Commons this spring. Sally says he slept on the floor for the 6 months he lived there, in a dirty room. He's been homeless for the last 2 months, in need of a higher level of services, but with nowhere to go.
There was no stopgap measure put in to take care of these people if they were evicted. So they basically just went back to a shelter and back on a waiting list, which is extremely sad and upsetting.
Hilly says the county, providers, and community all likely had different expectations for what Heartwood Commons would be.
So I think we've learned a lot, and going forward, of who we can best serve and who really needs a higher level of care that this independent living setting was just not designed to offer. And to serve a higher level of acuity, you would really need to staff it with more clinical positions.
Washington County reports 12 exits from Heartwood Commons in its first year. Some people transferred out, others went to jail, and 3 died. Hilly says if there's a lesson from year 1, it's that Oregon desperately needs housing and treatment facilities, places that can take care of people with mental illness and substance use disorders.
The focus needs to be on developing more of the settings that are appropriate for their needs. And we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go.
Sally Reed thought that's exactly what Heartwood Commons was built for, but she was wrong.
I think for now, going forward, it's perfect for what the county is now using it for. But it's sad we don't have an alternative now.
As it stands, the 54 rooms at Heartwood Commons are nearly all full, with people transitioning from homelessness to independent housing. People like Terrence Jackson, who plan to eventually move out to their own place.
It's better than being in a shelter, and it's given me an opportunity, and I'm actually happy. A lot happier than being in a shelter. It's one step closer to where my goals are.
Evan's with me now, and I don't understand how they can sell this as one thing to the public and then either change it or it evolves into something totally different.
It's part of that miscommunication when you have multiple government agencies and community partners and service organizations all working on a project. And granted, I want to make sure that we're explaining the point that it is doing a lot of good work and filling a needed gap, but as Marcia explained in this piece, some people had different explanations for permanent supportive housing, independent living versus what kind of population would be served here. And so ultimately, a year on, they've kind of ironed out what this building is for, but that still leaves a higher needs population that's not being served.
Yeah, so probably more of those need to be built or opened as well. What about Philip? He's the young man that you profiled. Where is he now?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked with his mom for about 2 months or so here. He has been homeless again, maybe in and out of some shelter on the street situations. He's currently waiting on some approval, hoping to get into another apartment, but like it has been for much of his life, not a very stable situation he's in right now. They were hoping this would be that answer. Didn't turn out to be the way.
And I noticed on that list that you had of people that left, about half either died or went back to jail. What's that tell us?
Yeah, the county would explain that as the population that's being served in a building like this facility and dealing with the homeless population in general, that you're going to have some of these cases like that, and that is not an irregular thing to see. So they say that's kind of the takeaway there, that you're going to have some kind of difficult outcomes, but they're ready for things like that, and that's what the county's told me.
Yeah, and the population they are there to serve, I guess, the people who are having a rough time of it.
Sure.
All right, thanks, Evan. Appreciate you bringing this out for us. And now it's your turn. What do you think about that? Was it an experiment worth trying? Are you surprised that the reality was not the same as what was promised? Send us an email, will you? We'd love to hear from you. The address is thestory@kgw.com, or if you'd rather, you can give us a phone call. The number is 503-226-5090, and then leave us a voicemail. Doesn't matter whether you're watching us live or later on YouTube. Let us know what you think. I look forward to hearing from you. Now to Multnomah County and an update on the city and county's bold homeless response action plan. We first told you about their lofty goals back in March, and after a few months of feedback and public comment, now their final proposal is public. Daisy Caballero explains.
I think it's a real positive step forward that the city and the county have come together on this plan.
Blanchet House Executive Director Scott Kerman is chiming in on the City of Portland and Multnomah County's final homeless response action plan that aims to house or shelter an additional 2,700 people by December of next year.
And I think they might take some criticism for that, that maybe the targets seem unrealistic. But I think we have to be swinging big.
The 55-page plan highlights all aspects of this crisis, including an aggressive 2-year plan to increase shelter capacity by 40% and add 1,000 new shelter beds. And while some may see this as ambitious, Kerman is rooting it on.
If we set our sights high like this plan does, then we have the opportunity to achieve big things and certainly work towards big outcomes.
Starting this month, plan partners will start to identify 20 commercial buildings in downtown Portland to convert into housing and open 276 new shelter beds by the end of this year. This updated plan also comes after hundreds of community members voiced their thoughts these last 2 months, asking a few things to be added to the plan, including better housing needs for refugees and asylum seekers, expand the behavioral health workforce, and funding additional day services for people experiencing homelessness, like the Blanchet House.
We don't necessarily get the same attention as housing and shelter, but we serve a lot of people who live in low-income housing and shelter, but rely on our services to help make ends meet or to form community.
Now, both the city and the county are expected to vote on this final plan sometime next month. If you'd like to read a little bit more about it, you can go to kgw.com. In Southwest Portland, Daisy Caballero, KGW News.
All right, thank you, Daisy. Still to come on the story. We often get your emails and voicemails asking, hey, what's going on with the statues in Portland? Are they coming back? Well, we're talking about Lincoln, Roosevelt, Washington, and of course the elk. Nearly 4 years later, we are now learning that some are expected to go back up, others are not. The details when the story returns. All right, one of the questions we get a lot here on this story is when are the statues that were taken down in 2020, when are those going to come back? They've been sitting in storage for nearly 4 years now while city leaders decide what to do with them. But now we do know that some of them are coming back, but not anytime soon. Statues of Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, George Washington, former Oregonian editor Harvey Scott, and a sculpture called The Promised Land, showing a family holding a Bible and a gun, were sprayed with graffiti and toppled by protesters. They felt the figures celebrated racism, slavery, and colonialism. The Thompson elk statue was also defaced. There are folks on both sides of the argument, of course. Some want the statues fixed and returned, others don't. City leaders have listened to pretty much everyone. Now there are plans to bring back the presidents and the elk, but the other two statues, Harvey Scott and the Promised Land, they are not coming back. The statue of George Washington will be moved to a new spot. It had been at Northeast Sandy and 57th since 1926. Right now, Washington is still in storage and needs to be repaired, but he'll eventually be moved to Washington Park, which, seems fitting. Lincoln is also in storage and needs to be fixed up, but he'll eventually be returned to his spot in the South Park blocks. Protesters pulled the statue down during an October 2020 Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage. Theodore Roosevelt was also targeted by protesters for his treatment of Indigenous people, but his statue will also be returned to the South Park blocks eventually. The statues of Harvey Scott and the Promised Land will not be coming back. Harvey Scott was a racist and a misogynist, and the city says the Promised Land was an inappropriate and inaccurate portrayal of the settlers of Oregon, excluding other races and religions in the state and insensitive to Indigenous people. And the elk, oh my gosh, the elk. We get more comments about that elk than any other statue by far. The elk will be returning to its same spot between Chapman Square and Lonsdale Square in downtown Portland. Repairs to the elk have been made and groundbreaking for the new fountain is set to start this fall, and you can bet we will cover that. Now to Washington, where you folks are certainly spending money. The latest figures show that the county, Clark County, outpaced all other metro areas in the state of Washington when it comes to retail sales. Tim Gordon tells us why.
We can all see it. Clark County is growing up. The Vancouver waterfront is a prime example of a build it and they will come atmosphere. The sleepy bedroom community of Clark County is a thing of the past. Single-family homes and apartment buildings are going up and selling.
And this is absolute supply and demand of economics.
UN Umesh is a professor of marketing at Washington State University in Vancouver. He says Clark County is doing better economically than any metro area in Washington.
Clark County is booming, and there are reasons. And the number one reason is people are moving into Clark County and staying here. They even shop here.
The numbers back the professor up. The Department of Revenue just released retail sales figures for third quarter 2023. Overall, they show the state slumping a bit, but not Clark County, where taxable retail sales climbed 1.69% over the year before for last July, August, and September. Compare that to King County, home to Seattle, where retail sales dipped 0.97%, and Pierce County, with its big city being Tacoma, sales dropped almost 5% during that period. Clark County has grown by about 100,000 people since 2010. Umesh says the county is very good at attracting people with good incomes from Portland. And right now, Portland is seen as struggling on several fronts. Part of the attraction north of the river, no income tax. With more people working from home, it makes a difference, giving people more money and no need to go into Oregon to spend it. We checked out Vancouver's Uptown Village to see if Main Street retailers feel the positive spending trend. At the high school Ace Hardware store, it's the busy season.
We got a much better April this year, which is kickoff lawn and garden for us.
Longtime businessman John Crawford says the third quarter was good for them last year.
And so far this year has turned out pretty good for us because we're right with about last year's figures, and those were good.
Back up at WSUV, Professor Umesh sees more positivity to come for places like Clark County at the expense of the biggest cities.
You're going to see this trend continue for 10, 15, 20 years, and maybe cities are at a crossroad. At this particular time, they have to decide how to get people back. The Vancouver waterfront is something that people want to be, Maybe Portland should do the same.
In Vancouver, Tim Gordon, KGW News.
All right, let's stay in Washington for a moment. Did you know that things like styrofoam takeout containers are now banned from being sold or distributed? It's part of a new state law that took effect this past weekend. It includes styrofoam food service products like cups, plates, to-go clamshells, trays, and food containers, as well as packing peanuts and single-use coolers. It's an effort to reduce the amount of waste that ends up in the landfills. The EPA reports only about 6.5% of the country's styrofoam products are recycled. Makes you kind of worry about where the rest goes. The new law bans businesses from passing out their current styrofoam inventory as well, so don't take it from them. If businesses refuse to comply, they'll face a $250 fine for the first offense and $1,000 after that. It's also worth noting that medical supply styrofoam, that's still allowed. Coming up next on The Story, our Environment Northwest team introduces us to pink snow, sometimes called watermelon snow, even blood snow. It's a phenomenon that likely has you wondering, well, how does that happen? Our team tagged along with researchers in the North Cascades to find the answer, and we'll show you when The Story returns. If you head out on a spring hike, depending on where you go, you might find something that looks like pink snow. No kidding. Obviously, we're taught to stay away from yellow and brown snow, but pink? Pink. Turns out it's actually due to algae, and it's not toxic, but it can contribute to faster melting of the glaciers. Erica Zuko with our Environment Northwest team joined researchers working to learn more about the colorful snow and how you can help.
You should bring the microscope out.
In this roadside van near the Mount Baker ski area in the North Cascades,
that's a good one.
Researchers have rigged up a custom field lab to test samples of snow algae, best known as pink snow.
It's almost at 0.004, so they're happy now.
We're measuring photosynthesis because people want to know whether snow algae blooms are getting worse because of climate change.
Climate change means warming temperatures, which melt glaciers faster. That endangers reservoirs the Northwest relies on.
I am seeing an individual algae cell, and this guy is swimming.
Dark-colored algae like these accelerate glacier melt because they're dark in color and absorb more sunlight.
Partly because of their bright red pigments, they act as sunscreen, and that's also what makes them red or pink.
Yeah, it's so small.
But we don't know how much they'll really play a role in the years to come until we understand the species themselves.
So you can see these patches are like fairly small.
That's why Western Washington University researchers are searching this lake for signs of the algae. Here at Picture Lake, late spring snow has covered up some of the blooms. But if you just remove some of the white snow on top, you can begin to see the pink snow underneath.
And we're just gonna scoop what looks the pinkest.
With Living Snow Project, volunteers across the globe also send in samples, scooping up snow using gloves and a free testing kit. And they're asking more people to get involved.
You can honestly find snow algae on the side of the road. Like, you don't have to be an intense outdoors person to participate.
The goal is to use the snow they sample at locations like this one to better understand how patches interact with the entire ecosystem living in snow.
So this patch right here is really red, where a patch over here might be not as red. By measuring its photosynthesis rates, what we can do is understand a little bit about how the biology is allowing it live in the snow in these light conditions and make a lot of biomass, because the more biomass that it makes and the darker the algae bloom is on the snow, the more it will melt the snowpack. So we're checking to see what stage these guys are in as well.
Once they've built up years, then decades of data, they can begin to discuss what the future may hold.
What we want to understand is how all of those different factors affect the biology, affect the photosynthesis, and affect the extent of blooming, so that we can make predictions about how these blooms will respond in the future.
Until then, they hope more people will keep an eye out for pink and report it, a way anyone can do research on the road. For Environment Northwest, I'm Erica Zucco.
How about that? You can be a scientist and a researcher. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. But remember, the story, our collective story, that never ends. It keeps going. The good stuff is coming your way next, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow night, 6:30.